moving into our last movements, we have galloping, sliding, and skipping. All again have very distinct definitions from each other, but they are different, very, very different from hopping and jumping and leaping, right? So with a gallop, it's characterized as a forward step onto one foot and a leap onto another foot. So galloping, sliding, and skipping they're different from all of the other ones in the respect that they are combinations of the other movements. So we don't really have a solidified, like you can't look at somebody galloping and say that they're leaping because different coordination pattern, right? So forward step onto one foot and then you leap onto the other foot. Okay, so it's more or less like if you look in the video to the right, okay, one leg stays in front of the body, and the leap component of the gallop is the back leg catching up with the front leg. Okay. We also have sliding, which is a sideways step onto one foot and a leap onto another foot. I have examples of this in a later slide. And then a more symmetric movement, right? So these are asymmetric, where you have kind of one foot to another foot. Symmetric is alternating, right? Step hops. So both legs get to participate, right, in doing all of the actions within the locomotor skill. So this is alternating a step and a hop on one foot and then onto the other, which you can see this dude just skipping through a field with a lollipop, I think. Yeah, anyways. So let's look at early characteristics that we might observe. This is an example of a gallop. Okay, so typically we're going to see, well, this video example is of a gallop. So we can watch it and then kind of talk about different characteristics that we see. Okay, so generally we notice pretty arrhythmic and stiff movements, little or no arm movement, little or no trunk rotation, exaggeration of vertical lift. So this is going to be pretty similar to like when we looked at hopping, right? Where you're not really traveling a lot in the horizontal direction, but more so in the vertical direction. And there's also a short stride or step length. So that's similar to the other locomotor movements that we've looked at in the early stages. But the gallop usually emerges at ages 2 or 3. So quite later, especially considering certain rate limiters that might play a role. We'll talk about those in a little bit, but being able to support your weight, right, in single support, etc. So if we look at this video again, right, you can see arm movements aren't super coordinated. There's some abduction, right, or arm swinging or winging. You can even see it towards the end of the galloping that the movement pattern switches into almost a skip and then back into galloping. Okay, so that's galloping. And then this is an example of a sidestep or sliding. Okay, so galloping precedes sidestepping or sliding. Reason being is that the majority of our movements as humans exists in the sagittal plane, and sidestepping or sliding occurs in the frontal plane. So our ability to control our center of mass is not as great in the frontal plane, just because that's not the way that we direct our movements, right? If you asked a crab to do this, they would be very stable. So I'll just play the video, but the characteristics are pretty much the same. Okay, you get very rigid movement, not really any coordination with the arms. Okay, you can actually even see that her toes start to try to face a forward facing direction. Okay, little to no trunk rotation. So everything is fairly rigid. Okay, so we have galloping that occurs first, then sliding or sidestepping, and then we get to skipping, which should pop up here. Okay, so skipping usually is going to occur between 4 and 7 years of age. So I think we said galloping is 2 to 3 years of age, right? So the time span between progression through all of these different skills can be quite varied from individual to individual. But again, characteristics are going to be pretty similar. So you can see coordination in the arms isn't quite there. There's quite a bit of swaying between landings, right? Or the weight shift is a little awkward from right to left foot as she does the step hop. Okay, it's more of vertical motion than horizontal. So those are good examples of that. Okay. And then we can talk about proficient galloping and sliding and skipping, right? Where similar to running, you don't really need the arms for balance anymore, but you generally have good body control and kinesthetic awareness. For skipping, specifically, the arms swing rhythmically in opposition to the legs, and that's to help provide momentum. And that's kind of unique to skipping. It's not really necessary in galloping or sliding. But if you were trying to like skip for distance, you would use your arms in a rhythmic way. So a proficient gallop might look something like this, right? Longer step, we got more of a horizontal movement. You can see more of a coordinated rotation in the trunk and the pelvis. And we don't need the arms, right? But I mean, they don't, just looking at it doesn't look quite as awkward as our early developmental examples, okay? But galloping rate limiters, if you think about all of our characteristics of early galloping, sliding, and skipping, right? It's coordination, right? And being able to uncouple the legs. So I think if you go back to the early galloping example, actually, I could do that, right? When we watch, you can kind of see this inability to uncouple the legs or move the legs independently of one another. It is very arrhythmic, right? Doesn't have a very consistent rhythmicity or cyclical pattern to it. Versus here in our proficient galloping example, you can see that there is a pretty defined rhythmic pattern and the legs are uncoupled in that sense. We also have differential force production, so being able to produce more of a vertical force on that front stepping foot and more of a horizontal force on the back leg as it's like acting for propulsion into the horizontal place or horizontal space. Oh boy. Okay. And then we have sliding. Again, sliding or sidestepping kind of used interchangeably, but the coordination is required, so being able to move completely in the frontal plane or turning to one side and being able to move in that one direction instead of kind of mixing in sagittal plane movements, which we kind of saw in the early sidestepping example where the toes kind of start to face where a forward walking movement might be. Okay. And then last but not least, we have skipping. Again, coordination is the largest rate limiter, but this is coordination in terms of the ability to perform 2 tasks with one leg. So developing the step hop from right to left sides. And this I thought was just kind of a fun example of being able to change directions with low impacts to balance. Okay. So last but not least, I want to kind of just give a general summary of what we talked about today. So generally, progression from one locomotor skill to another involves the following. We're going to increase stability. Okay, so rigid movements, wide base of support, arms assisting in the maintenance of balance, usually by abducting from the body, shorter distance traveled, slower speed, a shorter step length or stride length. Those are all methods and strategies to increase stability, right? So generally when we see early movement patterns, stability is prioritized. And then as we get to more proficient movement patterns, we see this gradual progression towards the trade-off from stability to mobility. And we get more coordination between all of the moving parts. So not only coordination in how we move our body in space, but how our legs maybe are performing alternating movements or performing symmetrical movements in terms of like the long jump where both feet have to land on the ground at the same time. Getting more towards a symmetrical or coordinated alternation type of movement characteristics, okay? And then that gradual coordination and building on that component is going to allow us to shift from stability to mobility. So anything that we initially saw in the early stages of that a given locomotor skill usually are the opposite once a person is proficient. So instead of a wide base of support, they might have a narrow base of support. They use their arms for counterbalancing instead of kind of using them to maintain their balance or stability. Typically, they'll have a longer, higher distance traveled and faster speed. Okay, and those are just some examples, but you can kind of see the pattern, right? And I said I was going to be repetitive. And then the last thing I want to mention as a summation of everything is that the individual constraints are most often going to be the rate limiters and the emergence and maintenance of locomotor skills. So a lot of the constraint examples or the rate limiter examples I gave you guys were individually based, right? Especially when we get into older adulthood, it's very dependent on a person's level of activity or if they have a movement disorder or not, right? So you can kind of think about more examples of individual constraints than anything. The next biggest constraint that you might consider for locomotor activity is the environment. Okay, task constraints I feel like may or may not play a role. It kind of just depends on the context of the situation and how you're incorporating the locomotor skill in a given task. But I think individual and environmental constraints are probably the easiest ones to come up with for these locomotor skills. All right, so that is all I have for you this week. You have a quiz on this lecture content as well as an activity. So if you have any questions, please let me know.